The first sound was not loud. It was deep, heavy, and distant, like the earth itself had been struck with a hammer. German soldiers along the frozen front looked up at the same time, unsure if it was thunder or artillery. For a brief second, nothing else happened. The air held still. The ground did not shake. A few men even returned to what they were doing. Then the sky opened. 1,000 shells began falling at once, and the world around them vanished before they could move. It was early morning on January 14th, 1945, near the Vistula River in Poland, just west of the city of Sandomierz. The winter had been brutal for weeks. Snow covered the ground in hard layers. Trees stood silent, stripped and frozen. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below. The German 4th Panzer Army held defensive lines across open farmland and small villages. The many soldiers believed the front would remain quiet for a few more days. Intelligence reports had warned of Soviet activity, but nothing prepared them for what was about to begin. The German positions were thin. Units were stretched across long distances, with trenches dug in frozen soil and bunkers reinforced with logs and sandbags. Supply lines had become unreliable. Fuel was limited. Ammunition was rationed. Many soldiers had been fighting for months without rest. They knew the Red Army was preparing something, but they did not know when or where it would strike. Inside one forward observation post, Oberleutnant Karl Fischer checked his watch at 4:34 a.m. The sky was still dark. A light wind moved across the snowfields. His radio operator adjusted a headset, listening to quiet static. Everything felt normal, and that was what made it dangerous. Fischer had fought on the Eastern Front since 1941. He knew the silence before Soviet attacks. He had seen it before major offensives, when the Red Army prepared massive artillery strikes before advancing. At 4:35 a.m., the first shell landed several kilometers behind the German lines. It was not aimed at soldiers. It struck a supply road. Then another shell hit a communications line. Within seconds, more shells followed. Artillery observers across the front began reporting impacts in multiple sectors at once. This was not random fire. It was planned. The Soviet operation had been prepared for months. The Red Army had gathered thousands of guns, mortars and rocket launchers across a wide front. The offensive was known as the Vistula Oder Operation, and its goal was simple: break through German defences, armour-sea push west at full speed, and open the road toward Berlin. The artillery strike that morning was the opening move. Colonel General Ivan Konev commanded Soviet forces in this sector. His artillery units had moved into position under cover of darkness. Guns were hidden in forests, behind ridges, and inside ruined villages. Ammunition had been stockpiled quietly. Crews had rehearsed their timing. Every battery had a target list. German trenches, bunkers, supply depots, and artillery positions were all marked. At 4:35 a.m., the signal was given. Thousands of guns fired in near-perfect coordination. The first wave struck communication lines and command posts. The second wave hit defensive trenches. The third wave targeted roads and rear areas to block movement. Then came the mass barrage, where hundreds of artillery pieces fired at once, filling the sky with falling steel. Back on the German line, Fischer felt the ground tremble beneath his boots. The radio crackled with frantic messages. Units reported explosions everywhere. One bunker had collapsed. Another trench had been hit directly. Telephone lines went silent. Runners began moving between positions, but many never arrived. Shells were falling too fast. You can almost feel the freezing wind cutting through the smoke as men try to orient themselves. Snow mixed with dirt and ash, turning the air thick and grey. Visibility dropped. The smell of explosives filled every breath. Soldiers crouched low, hands over helmets, waiting for the barrage to end. But it did not end. The Soviet artillery kept firing in waves. Heavy guns struck deep targets. Mortars hit closer positions. Katyusha rocket launchers screamed as they released volleys that landed in rapid bursts. The sound was overwhelming. It was not a series of explosions. It was one continuous roar, like the sky tearing open again and again. Sergeant Heinz Bauer, positioned near a machine gun nest, tried to shout orders to his squad. His voice disappeared in the noise. He could not hear his own words. A shell landed just behind their trench, throwing snow and dirt into the air. One soldier was knocked unconscious. Another clutched his arm, bleeding through his coat. Bauer pulled them deeper into cover, unsure where the next impact would land. The barrage lasted longer than most German soldiers had ever experienced. In earlier battles, artillery often fired for minutes before infantry attacks. This was different. It continued for nearly 2 hours in some sectors. The Red Army was not just softening defences, it was trying to erase them completely. German artillery attempted to respond. A few batteries fired counter-barrages, but many guns had already been damaged or destroyed. Others could not locate Soviet positions through the smoke. Ammunition supplies were limited. Command lines were cut. The defence began to fragment. Major Wilhelm Hartmann, commanding a defensive battalion, received reports of Soviet armour preparing to move. Through the haze, observers spotted silhouettes of tanks forming behind the artillery line. T-34 tanks waited in rows, engines running, ready to advance once the barrage ended. Hartmann understood the danger. If the artillery broke the German lines, the tanks would pour through. Inside Soviet lines, their artillery crews worked with calm precision. Officers checked firing tables under dim lantern light. Crews reloaded shells by hand, their gloves stiff with frost. Each gun team knew its role. Timing mattered more than speed. The entire offensive depended on coordination. Even a few seconds of delay could break the rhythm of the barrage. By 6:10 a.m., the shelling shifted forward. Soviet artillery crews began firing deeper into German rear areas, targeting reserve positions and supply routes. This change signalled the next phase. Infantry and tanks would follow. German soldiers slowly rose from trenches and bunkers. Many were disoriented. Some positions were gone entirely, replaced by craters. Units struggled to regroup. Officers tried to count survivors. Radios still crackled, but messages were broken and unclear. The front line had become a series of isolated pockets. Then the first Soviet infantry appeared through the smoke. They moved in waves, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns. Snow kicked up under their boots. Machine guns opened fire. German defenders returned fire where they could, but coordination was weak. Some units fought fiercely, holding positions for hours. Others were forced back within minutes. Fischer watched through binoculars as Soviet troops crossed open ground. He saw one tank roll over a trench that had been full of men only minutes earlier. He tried to contact artillery support, but no one answered. His observation post had become a lonely point in a collapsing line. The Red Army had learned from years of war. Their assaults now combined artillery, armour and infantry in tight coordination. Artillery did not stop once the attack began. It continued moving forward, striking new targets as troops advanced. This method prevented German forces from regrouping. You can almost hear the rumble of engines growing louder, the metallic clatter of tracks cutting through frozen soil. Every second brought the attackers closer. German soldiers fired until barrels overheated. Ammunition ran low. Communication remained broken. By mid-morning, several German sectors had already collapsed. Soviet forces pushed through gaps, surrounding defensive pockets. Some German units attempted counterattacks, but they lacked armour and support. The momentum belonged to the Red Army. Colonel General Konev monitored reports from his command post. Maps showed progress across multiple fronts. Breakthroughs were forming. Once those openings widened, armoured formations would move west at full speed. The objective was not just to win ground. It was to destroy the German ability to hold a line. Behind Soviet headquarters, supply columns stretched for kilometres. Trucks carried shells, fuel and food. Engineers repaired roads under constant pressure. The offensive was not only about firepower, it depended on logistics. Every gun needed steady ammunition. Every tank needed fuel. The scale of preparation allowed the advance to continue without pause. Inside a ruined farmhouse, Bauer and his surviving squad regrouped. They had lost contact with their battalion. Snow covered the bodies of fallen soldiers outside. The sound of fighting moved closer. Bauer checked his weapon and waited. Every man around him knew retreat might be the only option, but none had orders. Around noon, the Soviet tanks reached their sector. Machine guns opened fire on the farmhouse. Walls splintered. Dust filled the room. Bauer shouted for his men to withdraw through a back entrance. They moved across a field, staying low, trying to reach another defensive position. Behind them, artillery shells continued landing. The original boom that started the morning had turned into a constant storm. German soldiers realized this was not a single attack. It was the beginning of a massive offensive stretching across hundreds of kilometers. Major Hartmann tried to organize a defensive line along a small ridge. Survivors from multiple units gathered there. Some had no officers left. Others had lost all heavy weapons. Hartmann positioned machine guns where he could and prepared to delay the Soviet advance as long as possible. The ridge became a brief point of resistance. German troops fired steadily, slowing the attackers. A few Soviet tanks were hit by anti-tank weapons. Smoke rose from burning vehicles. For a moment, it seemed the line might hold. Then artillery returned. New waves of shells struck the ridge. The ground exploded around the defenders. Machine guns were buried. Trenches collapsed. The position was torn apart in minutes. Survivors scattered, running toward forests and villages behind them. By late afternoon, the German defensive structure had broken in multiple places. Soviet forces advanced rapidly. Tanks moved through open corridors. Infantry secured captured positions. Engineers cleared paths through minefields. The speed of the offensive shocked even experienced German commanders. Fischer finally received an order to withdraw west. His observation post was no longer useful. He gathered his radio operator and moved through damaged trenches. Everywhere he looked, the landscape had changed. Trees were shattered. Snow was black with soot. Craters covered the ground like scars. You can almost feel the exhaustion in every step. The cold presses through boots. The smell of smoke never leaves. The sound of distant artillery continues, reminding every soldier that the attack is still moving forward. Along the retreat route, German columns struggled to move. Vehicles slid on frozen roads. Some were abandoned after running out of fuel. Horses pulled supply carts through snow. Wounded soldiers were carried on improvised stretchers. The retreat was not organized. It was survival. The artillery strike that morning had achieved its goal. It broke coordination, destroyed defences, and allowed Soviet forces to push deep into German territory. Within days, the Red Army would advance hundreds of kilometres, reaching the Oder River and threatening Berlin itself. Historians later described that opening barrage as one of the most intense artillery strikes of the war. Thousands of guns firing in coordinated waves, shells landing across a wide front in perfect timing. It was not just firepower, it was planning, logistics, and experience combined. For the German soldiers who survived, the memory remained clear. One deep boom in the distance, a moment of stillness, then a storm of explosions that erased everything familiar. Trenches disappeared, bunkers collapsed, entire units vanished before they could react. As night approached, the battlefield fell into an uneasy silence. Fires burned across the snow. Occasional gunfire echoed from distant positions. Soviet forces continued advancing, securing villages and roadways. German survivors moved quietly through forests, trying to regroup. The war on the Eastern Front had always been brutal, but by 1945 the scale had grown even larger. Armies moved faster, artillery struck harder. Defensive lines struggled to hold against concentrated assaults. The balance of power had shifted. Bauer and his squad reached a forest by nightfall. They joined other retreating soldiers. Fires burned in the distance where villages had been hit. No one spoke much. They knew the front had broken. The question now was how far they would have to retreat before forming another line. Some soldiers wrote quick notes in small notebooks before sleeping. Others simply stared into the darkness. They had survived the day, but they knew tomorrow would bring the same thunder again. The Red Army was not stopping. Major Hartmann was later reported missing. Some believed he was killed during the artillery strike on the ridge. Others thought he was captured during the Soviet advance. Like many officers on that front, his fate remained uncertain. Fischer continued moving west with retreating units. He kept his binoculars close, though there was little left to observe. The war was closing in. Soviet forces pushed forward every day. The thunder of artillery followed them across fields, forests, and towns. Behind the advancing Soviet troops, engineers quickly repaired roads and bridges. Rail lines were restored. Supply trains began moving forward. The offensive was designed not just to break through, but to sustain momentum all the way to Germany. You can almost sense the weight of that moment in history. Soldiers on both sides understood the end was approaching, but they still had to survive each day. Every boom, every explosion, every step forward or back could decide who lived and who did not. The artillery strike near the Vistula River became a turning point. It showed how modern warfare had changed. Firepower could reshape entire battlefields in minutes. Coordination between guns, tanks, and infantry could break even determined defences. For those German soldiers, it began with one sound, a single, deep boom in the distance. They did not know its meaning at first, but within seconds the sky filled with falling shells, and the world they stood in vanished under a storm of fire. The memory stayed with them long after the battle ended, not just the explosions, but the moment before them. That brief silence, that feeling that something was about to happen, the instant when war shifted from waiting to survival. Days later, Soviet armoured columns continued west, crossing rivers and pushing through weakened defences. Town after town fell. German units tried to form new defensive lines, but they lacked time and resources. The speed of the advance changed the entire front. Some German officers later admitted that the artillery barrage broke more than positions. It broke confidence. Soldiers realized the Red Army could concentrate overwhelming force at any moment. No trench felt safe after that morning. Winter slowly gave way to early thaw, but the fighting did not slow. Artillery thunder echoed across Poland and into Germany. The road to Berlin had opened, and every kilometre was contested. And somewhere across that frozen landscape, Soviet artillery crews reloaded their guns, prepared their next targets, and fired again, pushing the front farther west, one thunderous wave at a time. If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.